Okay, everyone, it's my great pleasure to introduce a very dear friend of ours, a wonderful devotee who has participated in so many of our programs and our Labor Day weekend retreats and has spoken here before, Dr. Jeffrey Long, Professor of Religion and Asian Studies, who will be speaking this morning on the teachings of Jesus with regard to Vedanta. We'll let him explain a little better, and I will turn everything over to him. Everyone, please mute. Many of you will be watching this later in live streaming, but if you're here on the Zoom, please mute, and he will tell you at the end when he's ready for questions, and then you can unmute at that time. So I will now turn everything over to Dr. Jeffrey Long. Thank you, Jeff. We're very appreciative. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Maharaj, so much for that wonderful introduction, very gracious introduction. I'm very happy to be able to speak again to the community at the Vedanta Society of DC, even though we're doing it virtually, but that also allows me to show you pictures. So I'm going to share my screen, and you should hopefully be seeing, let's see, here we are. Hopefully you're seeing my PowerPoint that I've developed here for today's program. On this was there were several topics I could have discussed today, and I talked about several of them with the Swami Atmagyanananda before we actually settled on this particular topic. There's so many interesting things happening at this time of the year. Christmas, of course, is there. Christmas was also Gita Jayanti this year. It was the anniversary of the delivery of the Bhagavad Gita to Arjun by Lord Krishna. And of course, the Holy Mother's Jayanti is coming very soon as well. But we decided on this topic of Jesus as a teacher of Vedanta, a universal truth in the teachings of Jesus. So this idea of crazy suggestion, in our broken and divided world, the suggestion that Jesus could be seen as a teacher of Vedanta is likely to be met not only with skepticism, but even hostility from people coming from different points of view. For conservative Christians, the idea that Jesus was anything other than the Son of God, belief in whom is, according to their view, the only way to salvation, is beyond the pale of consideration. For many Hindus, to bring Jesus into a conversation about Vedanta raises the suspicion that one is pursuing a strategy to try to convert them covertly to Christianity by drawing them to Jesus and away from Vedic teachings. And for those who are skeptics or who just think in a very literal way, the suggestion that Jesus was a teacher of Vedanta would be just rejected with hardly a thought. They would say Jesus was Jewish, not Hindu. So, of course, from a Vedantic, the idea of Jesus as a teacher of Vedanta is not such a crazy idea after all. For what, after all, is Vedanta? A conventional definition of Vedanta is that it is a system of Hindu philosophy rooted in the teaching of the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita. More specifically, it is a collection of such systems with a number of variations, including non-dualism or Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism with difference or Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, dualism or Dvaita Vedanta, and a number of other systems that seek to reconcile the ideas of duality and unity, or Bheda Bheda. In the understanding of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, however, Vedanta can also be seen, in addition to all of these other things just mentioned, as the universal truth which underlies and unifies all religions and philosophies, as well as science. If we break down the word Vedanta into its component parts, it is Vedanta. The word Veda means wisdom or knowledge, and Anta, like the English word end, means final aim or goal. Vedanta, then, etymologically speaking, is the aim or end of all wisdom. Veda, conventionally speaking, refers to the sacred literature of the Hindu tradition, the books known as the Vedas. The final or end portion of the Vedas is the philosophical portion called the Upanishads. Because they come at the end of the Veda, these writings and the philosophy found in them have been called Vedanta. They are the Veda's philosophical conclusion. Swami Vivekananda points out, however, that the word Veda, in its original meaning, as a reference to wisdom, ultimately denotes something much more than a collection of sacred writings. In Swamiji's own words, the Hindus have received their religion. It may sound ludicrous to some how a book can be without beginning or end, but by the Vedas, no books are meant. They mean the accumulated treasury of spiritual laws discovered by different persons in different times. Just as the law of gravitation existed before its discovery and would exist if all humanity forgot it, so is it with the laws that govern the spiritual world. The moral, ethical, and spiritual relations between soul and between individual spirits and the Father of all spirits, were there before their discovery and would remain even if we forgot them. The discoverers of these laws are called rishis, and we honor them as perfected beings. What is the relationship of the texts called the Vedas and the universal wisdom called Veda? Swamiji says, although the supersensuous vision of truth is to be met with in some measure in our Puranas and Itihasas and in the religious scriptures of other races, still the fourfold scripture known as the Vedas, being the first, most complete, and the most undistorted collection of spiritual truths, deserve to occupy the highest place among all scriptures, command the respect of all nations of the earth, and furnish the rationale of all their respective scriptures. In other words, the universal wisdom called Vedanta is, as a universal wisdom, to be found in religious and philosophical texts and systems throughout the world. Because there are also many disagreements among the world's religions, though, how are we to say what is true in these varied systems and what is not? One clue is to look at what they share in common. There is a shared core of universal wisdom that can be found in many religious traditions and in all the religions that are widespread and have stood the test of time, the so-called great religions of the world. Philosopher Aldous Huxley, who was an earnest student of Vedanta, being a disciple of Swami Prabhavananda of the Vedanta Society of Southern California, referred to this shared core of spiritual wisdom as the perennial philosophy. Huxley describes this perennial philosophy in the following way in the opening lines of his classic book of the same name. Philosophia perennis. The phrase was coined by Leibniz, but the thing, the metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with divine reality, the ethic that places man's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. The thing is immemorial and universal. Apart from this shared core of wisdom, however, there are also many areas where religions, as we just noted, disagree with one another. Sri Ramakrishna taught that these topics were extraneous to the ability of one to achieve God realization by following a particular path. Topics such as, for example, the nature of the afterlife. If one is deeply interested, though, in the truth behind such topics, the Vedas provide, according to Swami Vivekananda, the most reliable guide when adjudicating questions of this kind, as he says again, the first, most complete, and most undistorted collection of spiritual truths. Returning, though, to Swamiji's teaching that the Veda ultimately refers not to the collection of texts which bear this name, but to universal laws which, like the law of gravitation, are capable of being discovered by anyone from any culture and at any place and in any period of history. If we take this idea seriously, then it becomes very easy to see how Jesus could be seen as a teacher of Vedanta. Veda refers, again, according to Swamiji, to the accumulated treasury of spiritual laws discovered by different persons in different times. Just as the law of gravitation existed before its discovery and would exist if all humanity forgot it, so is it with the laws that govern the spiritual world. The moral, ethical, and spiritual relations between soul and between individual spirits and the Father of all spirits were there before their discovery and would remain even if we forgot them. The discoverers of these laws are called rishis, and we honor them as perfected beings. Might it be that Jesus was one such rishi, one who discovered the deep spiritual laws that govern all creation and taught these to his followers as best as they could understand them in the time and in the culture in which they were situated? The question is not, was Jesus a teacher of Vedanta in the conventional sense? The question is, was Jesus a teacher of the universal truth, of the perennial philosophy, of Vedanta in the most profound sense of the term. Because our real question is about the universal truths of existence in the teachings of Jesus, it is not necessary to posit any historical connection between Jesus and the Vedanta tradition as we know it conventionally as a system of Hindu philosophy. Just as the same gravity operates in India and in Israel, and did so 2,000 years ago in the time of Jesus, similarly, the same spiritual laws operate everywhere and at all times. They are universal and eternal laws, or Sanatana Dharma. It is therefore perfectly conceivable that Jesus simply had profound insight and grasped the deepest truths of existence simply as he was and where he was, as a Jewish man living in Galilee at what we now call the first century of the era based on the timing of his birth. Indeed, other great rabbis of Jesus' time taught very similar concepts to those in Jesus' own teachings. The Rabbi Hillel famously taught, for example, what has come to be known as the Golden Rule. In his words, according to the Talmud, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation. Now go and learn. Another teacher who was a contemporary of Jesus was Philo, a philosopher from the Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt. One might recall that Jesus and his family fled to Egypt for a period of time, according to the gospel accounts of his early life. Philo of Alexandria harmonized the teachings of Judaism and Greek philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Stoicism, which has striking resemblances with the teachings of both Vedanta and Buddhism. Although it is not necessary for establishing Jesus as a teacher of Vedanta in the universal sense, the possible historical connections between Jesus and India are a fascinating topic in and of themselves. There were certainly ties between the largely Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean world of Jesus' time and India. These ties preceded Alexander of Macedon's conquest of Persia and incursion into northwestern India and the establishment of Greek kingdoms there. But they certainly accelerated after Alexander's time in what is widely known as the Hellenistic period. A variety of ideas from Indian philosophy found their way into Greek philosophy in this period, and via Greek philosophy into the Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament. Consider the opening verses of the book of Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities. All things are vanity. What profit has man from all the labor which he toils at under the sun? One generation passes and another comes, but the world forever stays. The sun rises and the sun goes down, then it presses on to the place where it rises. If one reads the original Hebrew from which these verses are translated, the expression all things are vanity can also be translated as all things are impermanent. Impermanence, impermanence, all things are impermanent. This, of course, is the first noble truth of Buddhism, that all phenomena are impermanent. And it echoes a central teaching of Vedanta as well, that all things must pass and that God alone is real. Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya. By the time of Jesus, Indic influence via Hellenistic influence was certainly an element of Jewish thought. Persian influence was even stronger and predated Hellenistic influence. Many aspects of the Zoroastrian faith of Iran, which has roots in the same ancient Indo-European culture that gave rise to the Vedas, came to infuse Judaism after the period of the Babylonian captivity, from which the Zoroastrian Persian Emperor Cyrus rescued the Jewish people, and in fact was hailed as a Messiah. It's interesting to note also that the three wise men, or magi, who are popularly believed to have brought gifts to the Christ child, are believed to have been Zoroastrian priests. One of them, in fact, is believed to have come from Gandhara, from Afghanistan, what's today Afghanistan, but what is, broadly speaking, a part of the larger Indic cultural sphere. As documented by New Testament scholar Marcus Borg and Buddhism scholar Jack Kornfield, many teachings of Jesus have striking parallels with those of the Buddha, and we can say by extension with the Upanishads, which bear many elements in common with Buddha's teaching. The close teachings of Jesus and the Buddha are gathered together by these two scholars in a book called Jesus and Buddha, The Parallel Sayings, whose cover I'm showing you here. Finally, there is the famous and tantalizing theory that Jesus may have actually spent some time in India. My personal view on this question is that there's simply no way to know if it is true or not. None of the evidence that has been presented on its behalf is indisputable. At the same time, it's not impossible that Jesus traveled to India. So whether he traveled there or not is basically a matter of faith, of what one chooses to believe based on the available evidence. Again, seeing the teaching of Jesus in a Vedantic light as reflecting the universal truths found in the Vedas does not require Jesus to have traveled to India. And even seeing Jesus' teachings as bearing the stamp of historical Indic influence can be justified based on the Indic influence that would have been part of his cultural environment as a Hellenistic Jew living in the first century of the Common Era. It nevertheless remains a fascinating story, which also connects in an interesting way with our own Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. The evidence presented for Jesus having traveled to India is of two basic kinds. It has long been a belief of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community that Jesus, hailed as a prophet in Islam, lived in India, along with his mother, after the events of his life as recounted in the Christian Gospels. So, according to the Ahmadiyya version, Jesus travels to India after the crucifixion, which he survives, and goes to India. And it's said that he lived in Kashmir and lived a long and full life there. There are tombs in Kashmir which are claimed to be of both Jesus and his mother, as well as the much more ancient Jewish prophet Moses. Again, whether it is actually the case that these figures are buried in these tombs is a matter of belief. The other piece of evidence is a text believed to be located at a Tibetan Buddhist monastery at Himis in Ladakh. A Russian explorer, Nicholas Natovich, claimed to have been taken in and cared for by the monks of the Himis monastery when he was wandering in the Himalayas. While at the monastery, according to his account, he was shown a text by the monks that recounted the life of Jesus, or Isa, in India. According to this account, it was not after the crucifixion, but rather during the so called lost years, the years of Jesus not described in the Bible, between the time when he was 13 years old and 30 years old, that it was during this period that he traveled in India. In 1922, Swami Abhedananda, a direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, traveled to the Himis monastery with the intent of exposing Notovich as a fraud. According to his account, however, he found that the text was genuine and he handled it himself. Subsequent attempts to view this text, however, have been refused by the monks at Himis. The topic thus remains quite controversial. From a skeptical perspective, one could argue that even if such a text does exist, it does not prove that the events narrated in it actually occurred. The verification that such a text does exist, though, would certainly be a find of great interest to the world. The fact of a Tibetan Buddhist text writing about Jesus in India would be an extremely interesting find. If Jesus did indeed travel to India, it would have been along one of the trade routes which linked the Roman Empire with the subcontinent. He would likely have passed first through what is now Afghanistan and then into northern India. During the time of Jesus, these areas had come under the control of the Kushan Empire, which was based in Central Asia. The Kushans practiced a blend of religions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism. They were major patrons of Buddhism, and India during Jesus' time was going through a period of Buddhist ascendancy. If he traveled in India and studied with holy men and scholars, it is likely that many of these would have been Buddhist. Early pre-sectarian Vedanta was also in existence at this time, and the core texts of Vedanta, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita, were in circulation largely through oral transmission and memorization, though it is possible that some versions were in writing by this time. The Vaishnav tradition was also very strong at this time, and bhakti was popular in the Indo-Greek kingdoms alongside Buddhism, as the pillar erected in 113 BC by Heliodorus, an Indo-Greek king and devotee of Vishnu, attests. That pillar is pictured here, and it's hard to see in this photograph. I've had a hard time finding a really good picture, but there's an image of Garuda, the Vahan, the vehicle of Vishnu, at the top of this pillar. It's not impossible that Jesus could have been exposed to both Buddhist and Bhagavata, that is, early Vaishnava thought and practice, if he really did visit India. Whether Jesus actually visited India, whether Indic thought influenced him only indirectly as part of the larger cultural mix of the time and place where he lived, or whether he was simply a deeply gifted and insightful individual who discovered the deep truths of existence by exploring his native tradition and having profound experiences of the kind attested by Sri Ramakrishna and other great mystics of the world's religions, it is likely that we will never know. We're each free to form our own conclusions in this regard. What is beyond dispute, however, is that many important Vedantic themes can be found in Jesus' teaching, as presented in the Christian Gospels. What are some of these themes? One theme that has already been mentioned briefly is that of the Golden Rule, the principle that we should treat others as we ourselves wish to be treated. Versions of this principle can be found in the teachings of every major religious tradition. We've already seen the version taught by the Rabbi Hillel, a contemporary of Jesus, who said, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." This formulation emphasizes avoiding doing anything that others might find to be harmful based on how we ourselves would feel if we were put in the same position. It is an injunction to practice empathy, to put ourselves in the position of others and then act accordingly. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, "Treat others the way you would have them treat you." This sums up the law and the prophets. This is almost word for word the same as Hillel's teaching. In Luke chapter 6:31, he says, "Do to others what you would have them do to you." In Matthew chapter 22, verse 39, Jesus goes further and explains why we should treat others as we wish to be treated. He gives the commandment, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." We should treat others as we wish to be treated because this is a natural, logical extension of loving others as we love ourselves. But why should we love others as we love ourselves? Although Jesus does not draw this out explicitly, at least in the Christian Gospels, if we're viewing his teachings through the lens of Vedanta, the answer is clear. In Vedanta, we are to see God in all beings. Before Jesus says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with all of your mind." If God is in all beings and we are to love God with our whole heart, our whole soul, and our whole mind, then it follows that we are also to love all beings in the same way, including ourselves. God, according to Vedanta, is the deep thread of unity that binds all of existence. Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, "All the beings of this world are strung upon me like pearls upon a thread." God is in fact our true self, the Atman which is identical with Brahman. In the words of Pravajika Vrajaprana, "My Atman and your Atman cannot be different." For that reason, Vedanta says, "Love your neighbor as yourself, because your neighbor is yourself." Some of the most deeply Vedantic teachings of Jesus can be found in his famous Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount has been deeply beloved by Hindu readers throughout the modern era, being a favorite of both Swami Vivekananda and Mahatma Gandhi. Swami Prabhavananda, in fact, wrote a commentary on this sermon called The Sermon on the Mount According to Vedanta. The sermon begins with a series of blessings or beatitudes. The first of these is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." According to Swami Prabhavananda, in this first beatitude, Christ speaks of the chief characteristic which the disciple must have before he's ready to accept what the illumined teacher has to offer him. He must be poor in spirit. In other words, he must be humble. If a man has pride in learning, wealth, beauty, or lineage, or has preconceived ideas of what spiritual life is and how it should be taught, his mind is not receptive to higher teachings. The second beatitude is, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." As interpreted by Swami Prabhavananda, this means the following. Swami Prabhavananda says, "The mourning which Christ calls blessed is very rare because it arises from a sense of spiritual loss, spiritual loneliness. It is a mourning which necessarily comes before God comforts us. Most of us are quite satisfied with the surface life we are leading. In the back of our minds, perhaps we are aware that we lack something, but we still cling to the hope that this lack can be filled by the sense objects of the world. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, "People weep rivers of tears because a son is not born or because they cannot get riches. But who sheds even one teardrop because he has not seen God?" It is the mourning, the crying out and longing for God, that is the prerequisite for the vision of God that was enjoyed by seers like Sri Ramakrishna. It was only after his many, many days of weeping and longing for the vision of the goddess Kali that he finally saw her in her true resplendent form as an ocean of light and love. The third beatitude is, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." According to Swami Prabhavananda, egotism must be overcome if the mind is to be freed from delusion. In the fourth beatitude, Jesus says, "Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." According to Swami Prabhavananda, this does not refer merely to ordinary righteousness in the sense of morality or justice, though it includes that. Swami Prabhavananda says the hunger and thirst after righteousness of which Christ speaks is a hunger and thirst after God himself. In the fifth beatitude, Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." In this beatitude, Jesus is expressing an implication of the law of karma. Whatever it is we wish to receive from the world, we must be willing to give. The universe is a mirror of our consciousness. If we wish to receive mercy from others or from God, we must be merciful ourselves. This is also reflected in some of Jesus' other teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, such as, if you want to avoid judgment, stop passing judgment. Your verdict on others will be the verdict passed on you. The measure with which you measure will be used to measure you. In the Lord's Prayer, also a part of this sermon, Jesus says we are to ask God to forgive us the wrong we have done as we forgive those who wrong us. In the sixth beatitude, Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." One cannot but be reminded of Swami Vivekananda's famous question to Sri Ramakrishna, "Have you seen God?" And Sri Ramakrishna's answer, "Yes, only more intensely than I am seeing you now." According to Swami Prabhavananda, purity in heart refers to removing all desire from our consciousness for anything other than God. Only when we are purely focused on God will we be able to receive the divine vision. If this focusing fully on God sounds impractical to some of us, we worry, what will happen to my family? What will happen to my responsibilities if I focus only on God? Jesus addresses this in the Sermon on the Mount as well. He says, "Seek first the kingdom of God, and all else will be given to you." And he refers in a very famous passage in the sermon to the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, and how beautiful they are and how God cares for them. And they don't have to work, they don't have to worry. So, how much more will God care for us? In the seventh beatitude, Jesus states, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." This brings to mind, of course, all the conflict that fills our world today, be it between members of different religions, different ethnic groups, different nations, or different political ideologies. The path to God, however, is the path of peace. It is significant that the central teaching of Sri Ramakrishna was that many paths can lead to God, and not only one, and that our tendency to view our way as the only right way is the cause of much of our suffering. Sri Ramakrishna was a great peacemaker in laying out the understanding that all of our various views can be seen as complementary, and each path can be seen as a path to divine. There's no need for us to compete or quarrel over our different belief systems. The path to God, though, is not an easy one. People who are deeply attached to their own worldview and way of thinking do not want to hear it challenged or be asked to accept that other ways are possible. This is why, in the eighth beatitude, Jesus says, "Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." If the world resists your path to spirituality, this may be a sign that you're on the right path. For the path of the spiritual person, of any religious tradition, is a challenge to the materialism that tends to dominate our world. If you live a spiritual life, your very being is a challenge to those who are wedded to the temporary passing things of this world. And it prompts them to look deeper into themselves and for what is lacking in life. And many find this uncomfortable. They will resist you accordingly. While the path to God may be difficult, It is not impossible. Those who wish to see God with their whole being will eventually achieve their goal. I believe one of the most important teachings of Jesus, also from the Sermon on the Mount, is be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. In the Christian tradition that is formed around the figure of Jesus, one often hears a great deal of emphasis on sin, that we're all sinners or that we're incapable as sinful beings of being perfect and drawing near to God. It is certainly true that so long as we remain under the delusion of the ego and do not allow the divine grace to flow into our hearts, we will remain sinful and imperfect. The teaching of Vedanta, though, is that the ego is not our true nature and it can be overcome. That Jesus agreed and that he believed, that he knew that it was possible to overcome this ego, to become truly pure in heart and see God, is evidenced by this teaching. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. If Jesus did not believe we were capable of attaining this perfection, he would not have commanded us to seek it. Many other aspects of Vedanta can be found in the teachings of Jesus. There are hints, for example, that Jesus took rebirth or reincarnation to be a reality, and that he saw goodness and truth in other religions. His central focus, though, was the realization of our potential for divine perfection. The Sermon on the Mount is essentially a guide to this realization. This is why Swami Vivekananda actually said, any man who truly realized the truth of the Sermon on the Mount would be perfect and would become a god immediately. So that is the end of my formal presentation. I was sharing with Swami Atmagyanananda before we started that as I began to write this and put this together, I realized that it would be easy to write a whole book about this topic. There are many things, many avenues I didn't explore because just the limitations of time, and I wanted to emphasize what I thought was most central. But I think now might be a good time to open it up to questions, and we can explore some of those avenues that I didn't cover in my prepared presentation.
We are muted. Yeah. Okay, everyone, don't be shy. That Dr. Long Jeffrey is going to handle this himself. So just unmute yourselves as soon as you have a question, and he'll be happy to answer.
Right. So please feel free to unmute and ask, or if you are a little shy, you can type it in the chat. But please feel free to ask questions.
Beautiful presentation. Really enjoyed it. Very informative and also excellent historic background. Can you expand on this one place where you talked about do good to others and why we should do good to others, and you gave several reasons. One thing I don't exactly remember, but if you can expand on that, Swamiji in his talks had given a beautiful reason of oneness as to why we should do to others as we wish the others should do to you. Can you just expand on what was Swamiji's version there exactly?
Yes, absolutely. That we should do good to others because ultimately the boundary between self and other is part of Maya, right? This is not a real boundary. In fact, we are all deeply interconnected. There's at the highest level, you could say we're all one. We're all Brahman. We're all part of one self. So just as we would not want to harm ourselves, typically, maybe you might think of an emergency situation where someone has to, one of those terrible stories where people have to cut off a limb to rescue themselves from danger. But in our ordinary life, we're not going to cut off our limbs. We're not going to harm ourselves. Because we are one organism and we care for our health and well-being. And the reality is, in fact, we are all part of one cosmic organism. And so to really understand this, we need to begin to see others as and ourselves as part of one being, part of one reality. So we should wish to harm someone else no more than we would wish to harm ourselves. We should see harm coming to others just as though it were coming to us. And in fact, this is the real meaning of compassion. That if someone else is suffering, I'm also suffering with them. And we are all interconnected in this very profound way. This is important for the spiritual path because what we're ultimately trying to realize is that we are Brahman. We're trying to ultimately realize our true nature as self, as spirit. And so part of that path is, as the saying goes, seeing God everywhere. And when we see God everywhere, when we see God in all beings, our spontaneous instinct would then be to do pranam, and right, to this is why we say namaste and clasp our hands, right? We're honoring the divinity within other beings. And so the idea is to translate this into our lives. If we had that perception, right, if we were enlightened, this would be how we would live spontaneously. Morality, as I understand it in Vedanta, is turning a spiritual practice, taking the spontaneous behavior of the enlightened ones and making that a practice for us, those of us who have not yet achieved that enlightenment. If we live like enlightened beings, we gradually become enlightened beings. We develop those sanskaras. We begin to spontaneously see the good in others. And this is a very widespread teaching. A tradition that comes to my mind when I think of this is the Confucian tradition from China. Confucius was very much about teaching people to live in an ethical way. And his belief was that if you lived that way and created those habits, then your heart would gradually be transformed. And after many years of practice, you wouldn't even have to think about what was right or wrong. It would just be your spontaneous nature. And this is how I understand Vedanta and Buddhism and a lot of the great spiritual traditions. So when I read the teachings of Jesus, I see a master who's trying to instill the same basic idea of oneness, to love others as yourself, and you will gradually see them as, in fact, yourself, that we are all one, and we should therefore do no harm to others any more than we would want to harm ourselves. And this eventually leads to the realization that of that oneness. That we may just start doing this because this is how our parents teach us, this is how our elders teach us, but if we practice it diligently, it becomes our nature, and we realize that is in fact our true nature.
Jeff, am I allowed to
Yes.
ask a question? I,
Please.
I enjoyed every aspect of it, the historical, the philosophical, spiritual, but I'm a little curious about some historical things. We hear a lot about the Essene communities that were
Yeah.
around at the time of Jesus. I don't know too much about them. I'm wondering, is this direct Buddhist influence that some Buddhist travelers actually came there? And also wondering about, was this responsible for the monastic tradition to come into what later became Christianity, which wasn't there in the Jewish tradition?
Yeah, those are wonderful questions. And this is one of those threads that I didn't pick up in my presentation, but I'm happy to talk about it now. Yes, the Essenes were a monastic community. And for those who know something about Judaism, monasticism is sort of not the norm in Judaism. And so there was this thriving monastic community. Where did it come from? There is a lot of speculation about that. And there is a theory that it was Buddhist influence because we know that Ashoka sent Buddhist missionaries, Buddhist monks, to all the lands adjoining his empire. So, very famously, Buddhist monks went to Sri Lanka and they went to Southeast Asia. And sometimes people say, well, why didn't Buddhist monks go west? Well, they did. And in fact, there's evidence of Buddhist monks getting as far west as Alexandria in Egypt. And of course, we know there was a thriving Jewish community in Egypt, and there was a lot of philosophical exchange going on amongst different philosophies, different groups. The Library of Alexandria was a famous site for debate and disputation and even scientific experimentation. There was even a rudimentary steam engine that there are accounts of that was invented in Alexandria. So, all these thoughts going on. There was a group also besides the Essenes called the Theraputai, who were a Jewish group who were also monastic in their lifestyle. And they practiced something that sounds a lot like Hatha Yoga. And in fact, we get our words therapeutic and therapy from the name of that group. And the Essenes seem to have been a similar kind of monastic branch of Judaism that was probably receiving some of these ideas either directly from India, from Buddhist monks, or indirectly via the influence Buddhist monks had on the whole society, on the Hellenistic culture. And so the Essenes lived in a secluded way. They lived at a place that's now called Qumran, right next to the Dead Sea. I actually got to go there many, many years ago and see the place. Most people know them as the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were their writings, and they had their own versions of many of the sacred scriptures. And they saw themselves as being set apart from the main priesthood of Judaism at the time, which was centered in the temple in Jerusalem. And they viewed the temple priests as corrupt. And they saw it as important to withdraw from society and pray and meditate and live in a solitary way in the desert. The link between the Essenes and Jesus is very interesting because there's another theory that the figure John the Baptist, who is a character in the Gospels who precedes Jesus and actually baptizes Jesus, there's a lot of theory that John was either an Essene or maybe a member of that group who broke away and established his own community. There are still followers of John the Baptist today in Iraq. They're called the Mandeans. They're a religious minority and they've been persecuted a lot, but that tradition continues to the present day. And baptism, this sort of immersion in water as a purification ceremony, is something that the Essenes did a lot. It was part of their regular practice. And Jesus is depicted as being baptized by, being sort of initiated, you could say, by John. And this practice of immersion or baptism, of course, bears very strong resemblances to the kind of sacred bathing in rivers that people do in India. So that whole concept of going to a river for purification might have come through the Essenes, from India through the Essenes to Jesus. Now, of course, water is something purifying. That's also possibly just a universal reality. People clean themselves in water everywhere, but the using it in a ceremonial way is a very interesting kind of link. So yeah, the Essenes are one connection, and they certainly seem to have had some kind of influence on what would emerge as Christian monasticism. The second part of your question, because a lot of the early church fathers also withdrew to the desert. The desert was sort of the natural place to go and find seclusion and be with God, much like the jungle was in India in ancient times. There always talk of the sages going out into the forest. The Buddha went out into the forest. So in West Asia, in what we call the Middle East, they went into the desert. And the Essenes seem to be part of that heritage of monasticism that gets passed via Judaism into Christianity. There are definitely connections there. And in fact, Swami Vivekananda himself said some very interesting things about this. And I'm not sure what his sources of information were, because not yet was actually known in the mainstream world about the Essenes yet during Swamiji's time. But he connects the type of ceremony that's performed in the Catholic Church and also a lot of the monastic traditions. He traces that back to Buddhism in some of his in some places in the complete works. So there seems to be a strong Buddhist connection going there between from India to Judaism via the Essenes and then via them to Christianity.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of archaeological evidence also of statues of Buddha with Greek-looking features and things like that to show
Yes.
that it traveled all the way to Greece and then back again, and many interesting things. Yeah.
Well, and the Indo-Greek kingdoms are certainly a big part of this story, because they were the link between India and the Western world. And in the event that Jesus did travel to India, he probably spent a lot of time in those areas because he would know the language. And because Greek was, that was kind of the universal language all the way from Rome to India because of Alexander's conquest. So he could have gone there, and there were Buddhist monasteries like Takshila, that was part of one of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. So it's not unlikely that those connections are there.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay,
Dr. Wong, can I ask you a question about speaking to Christians?
Sure.
Thank you for the great talk. This was wonderful. I was very active in Christian ministry for a long time, and after sort of leaving religion altogether, found Vedanta, and this has been very wonderful hearing the intersections you brought out here. Very great talk. Thank you. As you're working to, as you're chatting with your students or your colleagues, many of whom probably come from a Christian background, has there been anything you found helpful in talking to them, to Christians, about Vedanta? It's sort of a slam dunk to cover the teachings of Jesus here to devotees. It's wonderful. There's so much material here. But as you're talking with your Christian friends, is there anything that you've been able to generalize or found helpful in doing that?
Well, I find that when explaining Vedanta concepts, if I can quote from Jesus, that really helps, because I mean, there is no higher authority from a Christian perspective. And if they can see those connections, then they're much more receptive, because they don't see it as so alien. And in fact, I'll tell you an interesting story that was told me by my guru, Swami Tyagananda, in the Vedanta Society. He's from the Vedanta Society of Boston. And I don't think he'll mind me repeating this, because I've heard him tell the story many times. But he was asked to speak to a Mormon group, interestingly, and to talk about Vedanta. And he did a little experiment.
I grew up Mormon, actually, so that's interesting to hear. Thanks.
So this connects. Well, tell me what you think about this. He minimized his use of Sanskrit terminology. So instead of Brahman, he talked about God. Instead of Atman, he talked about spirit and soul and so on. And he put things in English as much as possible. And I don't think he was doing this thinking in terms of interreligious relations. I think just in terms of basic communication. So it would be understood by people who weren't familiar with India. And he said they were so excited. They said, "That's what we believe too. Oh, this is what we also teach." And so it was very, very interesting, what he experienced. That he was, when he was able to translate the terminology, people responded to it very positively. Another thing that I found also is that there is sort of, I guess, what you could call official or standard Christianity, doctrines taught in churches. And then there is what ordinary believers believe. And I have found that in a lot of my interactions with Christians, for example, the idea of non-duality, right? That God is not only sort of a being outside, kind of creating the universe, but dwells within the hearts of all beings. That really resonates with a lot of Christians. And I've also found quite a few Christians who are either believe in or are very receptive to concepts like karma and rebirth. They say, well, karma, well, that's just divine justice. And rebirth just makes sense. I mean, that's one reason why I was drawn to Vedanta also. In fact, your question gives me an opportunity to mention something I didn't think I had time to go into in my formal remarks. But there are a couple places in the Gospels that are very suggestive of the idea of rebirth. My favorite one is there's the story of Jesus who heals a man who was blind from birth. So he was born blind, and he heals the man, and his disciples, excuse me, his disciples asked the question, he was born blind. Was he blind because of a sin that he committed or because of a sin that his parents committed? Now, if he was born blind, and the possibility was in the disciples' minds that it could have been because of a sin he committed, well, when did he do that? There's not a lot of sinning you can do as an embryo, right? So there just seems to be an assumption that there was some prior existence where this man could have sinned. And in fact, there are traditions in Judaism that do affirm the idea of rebirth. And it was a pretty widespread idea in the ancient Greek world. Plato talks about reincarnation. Pythagoras talks about reincarnation. So even some of those ideas, which would be, I think, seen as deviating from, I guess, what you might call a formal or official doctrine of Christianity, a lot of Christians are quite open to that. And I think it's important, and I think this would be, I guess, a basic rule of any kind of interfaith dialogue, is just to be respectful and not to, even while you're expressing ideas that people might find extremely radical or strange from their point of view, to do it in a respectful and loving way. And I think this is where our stance in Vedanta of not proselytizing is important. We want to explain it, we want people to understand it, but what you do with it is up to you. Right. And Sri Ramakrishna said you can reach God through any of these other paths anyway. So there's no need to try to, make Christians think Vedantically or something like this. So if we come with that attitude of this is how we see it, and we're offering this to you to do whatever you want with it. I think that helps as well. When people feel like they're being preached to, then they tend to react very negatively. That's what I tend to find. And teaching is better than preaching. Preaching has its place, but that's for people who have come for that. But everyone else is like, no,
Yes.
I didn't sign up for this, they say.
Yes, those are great comments, and thank you. I suppose as I'm working to build bridges or some sense of resonance with fellow Christians, whether to start with familiar Christian terms to refine and to expand those, or to sort of reset the table a bit and introduce some Vedantic ideas, and how you found, it could work either way with students or with your colleagues. Thank you for the comments. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Someone's asked a really good question in the chat. Someone has said, in Christianity, it seems as if you cannot reach God unless you go through Christ. And I'm really glad you asked this question, because this is another big topic that I wanted to address, but just didn't feel that I could fit it necessarily into my formal remarks. But if you look at Hindu appreciators of Jesus, like Sri Ramakrishna, like Swami Vivekananda, like Mahatma Gandhi, and others, they all make a distinction between the teaching of Jesus and what has emerged as Christianity. And I think this is a really important distinction, that what we maybe could call the mainstream Christian tradition, the way it interprets Jesus and his teachings, is in this very exclusive fashion, that the only way to salvation basically becomes to be a Christian, right? To believe in Jesus and follow that path. And this is why Christians, of course, want to convert other people to Christianity, because, well, they love you and they don't want you to go to hell, so you need to be like them, right? You need to be a Christian. And I don't think I even need to tell this audience how much misery this has created in human history, and conquest and destruction, and both on a mass scale in terms of the clash of civilizations and spread of particularly of European domination around the world in the name of this idea. And then also on the individual level, how families get torn. If someone converts to a different faith tradition, if they're, like I was just saying to Josiah, if you're kind and you're loving and you're presenting it as, well, this is how I understand it, this can work very well, and families can coexist together. But if someone converts to something and they say to the rest of the family, you're all going to hell until you do what I did, well, that's a recipe for ill will, and this has been the story very often throughout history. And so my personal understanding, coming from a Vedanta perspective, is that if we want to see Jesus as a teacher of Vedanta, then we have to see any of his sayings that might be taken in this sort of exclusive fashion. We have to say that they're being misunderstood. And of course, the one that you hear the most comes from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And so Christians for centuries have interpreted that to mean the only way to God is through Jesus. But if you read the Gospels with a knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, or one of the other great classic spiritual texts from Hindu or some of the other traditions, but I'm going to take the Gita because I think it's the one that illustrates this very well. Throughout the Gita, Lord Krishna is saying, take refuge in me, follow me, focus your heart on me. And is he referring to the man Krishna who was born at a certain time, who was related to the Pandavas and participated in the Mahabharata war, and then was shot with an arrow by a hunter? Is he referring to the universal consciousness that is Krishna in the most profound sense, the Krishna who reveals himself in the 11th chapter of the Gita as the divine being who is within all? When I read the Christian Gospels, if Jesus says something like, you must come to the Father through me, I take that me to refer to the Paramatman, to that supreme soul that manifests within him and that is ultimately in all of us. I don't take it to refer to Jesus of Nazareth, who lived for a certain duration of time. And in fact, even within the Christianity, this distinction is made. You'll sometimes see references made to the cosmic Christ or the mystical body of Christ. And on its deepest understanding, this is not something that's limited to the man Jesus, but encompasses all of existence. So we're basically talking about the same kinds of realities that we see in the Hindu tradition. So the universal consciousness, divine being that is all encompassing. And in some of my work, I've done some comparative theology. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Father Frank Clooney, who he's coming from a Christian perspective as a Catholic, but he'll often juxtapose Christian and Hindu writings and see how they sort of talk to each other in very interesting ways. And I think if you bring together that passage from the Gospel of John where Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," if you bring that together with the 11th verse of the 4th chapter of the Gita, where this was quoted by Swamiji in his famous Sisters and Brothers of America speech, where he says, "In whatsoever way living beings approach me, thus do I receive them. All paths lead to me." If you bring those two together, those two verses, it has an interesting kind of resonance. We start with Jesus saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." And then we add to that what Krishna says, "And in whatever way you come to me, I will receive you. All paths lead to me." So you have the idea that there is, in one sense, one way, right? Which is the realization of our inherent divinity. But how to achieve that realization, that can come, as Sri Ramakrishna taught, through Christianity, through the jnana yoga, karma yoga, through Buddhism, through a variety of methods, a variety of yogas. So this is the part of Christianity, I think, certainly for those of us who are in the Vedanta tradition, that we find most problematic, that this idea of exclusion. But I think if we look at Jesus as a Vedantic teacher, we don't see him actually teaching that, right? The I that he uses when he uses the word I is the I that Krishna uses in the Gita, right? He's speaking as the divine being, not as, worship me exclusively or else you're lost. In fact, there's a very interesting, in the same gospel, Jesus says a couple things. He says, "There are many mansions in my Father's house." And there's another passage shortly before he leaves the disciples and ascends to heaven. He says, "I have other sheep and other flocks that I must tend to." And I take both of those verses to talk about other religions, right? That Jesus came for the Jewish people; they were his audience, right? The people to whom he was bringing his message, but that all people are on the path ultimately. And so I think, I mean, I really deeply disagree with this particular Christian teaching, but I think there's a way of appreciating and understanding Jesus that doesn't have to lead us down that road of exclusionary thinking. Okay. When it gets quiet, that's either very good or very bad.
This is,
I know I'm explaining
this is your
everyone.
your last chance. Don't be shy. Otherwise, so there's still somebody waiting. How is that possible? Otherwise, we will offer our very, very sincere thanks to Jeff, Dr. Jeffrey Long, for a very wonderful presentation. Really, this beautiful blend of the historical and the philosophical and the spiritual really gives a very nice overview and very, very appropriate, of course, for this time of year, for the Christmas time. So, Jeff, many, many thanks. We hope that you'll agree to join us many, many more times in the future. And we send everybody all of our best wishes for Christmas season and for a very blessed New Year.